Melbourne, 2013. The boxers arrive on a Tuesday. Tom Hogan is a detective senior constable with a cold case unit. He's worked plenty of difficult cases before. Old cases, cold cases, cases where the trail went to nothing and stayed there. He's not a man who frightens easily, and he's not a man given to drama. He's methodical, patient, the kind of detective who reads everything before he forms a view. And in front of him, 1,100 reports, more than 2 decades of interviews, forensic notes, running sheets, tip-offs, dead ends. It's the accumulated weight of an investigation that consumed years of other detectives' lives and produced no arrest, no trial, and no answer. The paper inside isn't crisp. Some of it has that particular quality of documents that have been handled many times, softened at the edges, faintly discoloured, even the occasional coffee stain. The texture of something that has been picked up, read, set down, and picked up again by people who couldn't let it go. Hogan sits down, and he opens the first report. The Old London Coiffure, Portland, Victoria, May the 3rd, 1991. 2 women on an otherwise normal Friday afternoon, and their tragic end in a locked shampoo room. Over the next few weeks, he is going to devour every single one of those 1,100 reports. And by the time he's deep enough into it to form a picture, something begins to bother him. Not a single thing, but a pattern that he's noticed. A shape that starts to take some sort of form in the negative space of the investigation. Something that was looked at briefly and then looked away from. He continues to read, continues to take notes, continues to sharpen the edges of that shape. Last time on Struth, we traced the murders, the crime scene. We spoke about the horrible man who came into that salon 3 weeks before the event and said he'd be back. We left with a courtyard, a running figure, and a question that has no answer. If you haven't listened to part 1, please go back and do so now, because this is going to make a heck of a lot more sense. I'm your storyteller, Mark, and this is part 2 of the Old London affair. What Hogan finds is an investigation that's run for years. 5,000 people have been interviewed, and detectives travel to every Australian state. There are certain leads that develop enough shape to follow seriously before they dissolve. The first one relates to Gordon Smith, a Portland local, a former army apprentice electrician whose life has sadly been shaped by schizophrenia and amphetamine use in approximately equal and mutually worsening parts. Interestingly, the information that pulls him into the investigation comes from a family member. A relative tells police that Gordon confessed to the murders. Even his mother doesn't quite contradict this. She acknowledges instead that his illness causes him to believe he might have been responsible for things he did not do from time to time. He can't account for his whereabouts on the afternoon of May the 3rd. He is seen in town, and he's never eliminated. Gordon has no criminal convictions, only drug-related charges. He doesn't fit the profile of a man capable of planning and executing a double murder in the middle of a Friday afternoon and getting away with it. He does, however, seem capable of the behaviour that was reported 16 days earlier in that salon. And he can't be cleared, so he can't be released from suspicion. And indeed, detectives do, from time to time, return to him. And here is where the investigation acquires a particular complication. Because the relative who told police about Gordon's confession is Russell Smith, Gordon's cousin. You see, Russell has his own history, a rap sheet going back to his teenage years, including a jail sentence for his role in the unprovoked fatal bashing of a 46-year-old man. He too suffers from mental health difficulties, challenges he doesn't get the appropriate levels of support for. And he too could not account for his movements on the afternoon of May the 3rd. And police, as they turn this lead over and over, find themselves sitting with an uncomfortable question. Is Russell telling them about his cousin Gordon out of conscience? Or is he pointing to a man conveniently because he knows that he has an illness? He knows that he's incoherent. He knows that he's unable to reliably account for his whereabouts. He knows it might take a bit of pressure off his own shoulders. It's a question that sadly will never be answered. Under renewed police scrutiny in 1998, Gordon Smith moves to Melbourne. 10 days later, a caretaker finds him hanging inside a city cathedral. He leaves no note. That same year, Russell Smith too dies by suicide in remand. Days after his 33rd birthday, he uses a shoelace. And with that, the lines of inquiry into both men reach an end that is, in every sense, inconclusive. What either of them knew or didn't know about what happened in the shampoo room on May the 3rd, 1991, they took it with them. A third person of interest, Brian Petrie, is interviewed and never cleared. He's also now deceased. The investigators threw all sorts of leads up against the wall to see if they could stick. Serial killer Peter Dupas is investigated. A yachtsman later convicted of an unrelated murder is also believed to have passed through Portland at around the relevant time, but there's insufficient evidence to proceed. There's a lead that connects the murders to a 1993 stabbing in Sunbury. This too was followed but eventually closed. Detective Morris will later say, with evident frustration, that the investigation could have hung its hat on several of these leads, but each time, under thorough scrutiny, they evaporated. And then there's Stuart Pearce. On January the 6th, 1991, just 4 months before the Portland murders, a man named Stuart Pearce allegedly murdered his wife Meredith and 3 of their children at the family home in Parafield Gardens, a suburb of Adelaide. Meredith was bound to a chair. A towel was forced into her mouth. The 3 children, aged 11, 9 and 2, were suffocated. Pearce calmly attended and then finished his overnight shift at a petrol station that morning and disappeared. The house was set alight behind him, and he's never been found. He's still wanted. An Interpol Red Notice remains active. A $1 million reward has been on offer for more than 30 years. Stuart Pearce, if he's alive, would be in his late 60s today. A month after the Portland murders, an unconfirmed sighting of Pearce was reported in Portland itself. He was known to have connections to the Mount Gambier region, the stretch of country that sits between Adelaide and Portland. The same country anyone travelling between those 2 cities would pass through. Victorian detectives investigated him as a person of interest and ruled him out. But the reasons for that ruling have never been publicly detailed. But what is publicly known is that at the Portland crime scene, Margaret Penny was bound to a chair, an electrical cord tied around her wrists and looped around her neck. At the Adelaide crime scene 4 months earlier, Meredith Pearce suffered a similar fate. Both women were restrained, and although the instruments differed, the method certainly shared a logic. But let's go back to Robert Penny. Not as a suspect, as a man, as a widower, as a figure the investigation moved past pretty quickly at first, but then couldn't stop returning to. In the days after the murders, Robert presents to detectives as a grieving husband. He's 59 years old, a retiree, polite, cooperative, consistent. He was at home with his granddaughter all afternoon. He was building her a swing, for crying out loud. And Margaret had taken the car, so he had no obvious way of getting anywhere. But there is one problem with that last bit. While his son Tony was overseas, Tony had left his car with Robert and Margaret, telling them to use it whenever they needed. Robert tells detectives that he had no access to a vehicle on May the 3rd. He omits the fact that he did have access to Tony's car. It's Tony himself who eventually discloses this years later, calling Tim Acocks, Claire's son, to get it off his chest. And Tim reports it to the original investigators, but they see no reason at that time to change their view of Robert Penny. After all, he has an unblemished record. He doesn't seem capable of the frenzied violence required in that shampoo room. And he's well known around Portland. He just doesn't fit. Within a year of Margaret's death, Robert Penny is in a relationship with a woman named Kim Kamali. And by September 1992, 14 months after the murders, they're married. Nobody in the initial investigation asks Kim when the relationship actually began, whether it was already underway before May the 3rd. Indeed, there was very few questions asked about Robert and Penny's marriage itself. Some who knew the couple described it as loving and happy, but others volatile, difficult, and not as it appeared from the outside. And this fact goes largely unexamined itself. Robert Penny's son wasn't interviewed until 1995, 4 years after his mother's murdered. So these things, the lack of questions about the relationship between Robert and Kim, the belated interview of Robert's son Tony, the lack of questioning around the marriage itself, they're not small omissions. They are the kind that, when a cold case detective reads 1,100 reports 2 decades on, make him set the file down and sit quietly for a while, letting the grey matter go to work. And that detective in 2013 is Tom Hogan. He later describes Robert Penny as curiously overlooked. And that's a careful phrase, a careful choice of words. He means something far more pointed. Hogan decides to rebuild the case from the ground up. He bugs Robert Penny's house. He bugs his phone. He interviews witnesses who haven't been spoken to in decades. In February 2014, a phone intercept captures Robert Penny, now in his 80s, discussing a theory about a hitman. It's not a confession. Robert Penny doesn't say on that recording that he hired someone to kill his wife. What he does say is murkier than that. He floats the idea of a hired killer as a possible explanation for what happened in the salon. He discusses it as a theory. Maybe he discusses it because it was raised by Alice. Or maybe Alice came to that conclusion for good reason. But either way, the conversation matters to Tom Hogan. He doesn't believe Robert Penny is a man who should be casually theorising about hitmen. Robert is a man who told police in 1991 that he was completely in the dark about what happened to his wife. A random, senseless act, a robbery perhaps, a grudge against the salon. A man with no knowledge should have no more reason to land on the hitman theory than on any other. And yet here he is, more than 2 decades later, turning it over with particular familiarity. Not as speculation the way a stranger might speculate, but perhaps as a man who has been sitting with something for a very long time. So when investigators look at the totality of what they have, the intercept becomes one piece in a larger pattern. The tail comb comments on the evening of the murders. These are details that no outsider could have known and wouldn't have guessed. The insistence on the granddaughter Alice staying home that morning. Kim Kamali never being asked about the timeline of the relationship, but a new marriage appearing just 14 months after Margaret's death. None of it's a smoking gun. The Director of Public Prosecutions knows that, but in Australian law, a murder charge doesn't require a confession. It requires sufficient evidence to put a case to a jury and allow 12 people to weigh it. The theory is that a jury, presented with the full pattern, the timing, the knowledge, the behaviour, that phone interception, might reasonably conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that Robert Penny was involved. It's very much a circumstantial case, but circumstantial cases convict people in Australia every year, and the prosecution believes this one is strong enough to try. And so, in April 2015, Robert Penny is charged with the murders of Claire Acocks and Margaret Penny. He's 83 years old and he's released on bail. The committal hearing begins in November 2015. On the second day of that hearing, a forensic DNA report arrives. Over the years since 1991, scientists have worked with crime scene material. A blood-stained tissue recovered from the salon floor. And eventually they isolate a partial male DNA profile, one person's genetic material, left behind in that shampoo room on the afternoon of May the 3rd. That profile does not match Robert Penny. It doesn't match anyone in the database. When the magistrate Carolyn Gwynn hears the DNA result, she all but invites the Crown prosecutor to abandon their case. The hearing's adjourned, a trial is prepared. But it will never happen, because on March 26, 2016, Robert Penny dies in a Geelong hospital. Complications from diabetes, emphysema, cirrhosis, vascular disease. His lawyer maintains his innocence. He says nothing. There's no deathbed confession. Following Robert Penny's death, Victoria Police apply for a fresh coronial inquest. The inquest is heard by coroner Jackie Hawkins across January and February 2017. She hears all the evidence about the tailcomb comments, about the DNA profile. She reviews the investigative record. She listens to the recordings of Robert Penny being interviewed by police. He's calm, credible, consistent. And she delivers her findings on June the 30th, 2017. She is not satisfied on the balance of probabilities that Robert Penny was involved in or arranged the murders of Claire Acocks and Margaret Penny. She finds that the DNA evidence excludes him from being there. She does consider the tailcomb comments highly unusual, but also open to different interpretations. She dismisses the hitman theory, and she names Gordon Smith, Russell Smith, and Brian Petrie as persons of interest who were never eliminated and cannot now be. She notes there are other unnamed persons of interest, and she also notes that there are investigative avenues that remain open. Her final finding? This homicide investigation remains open. So what does 35 years of investigation leave you with? It leaves you with a partial male DNA profile, isolated from a blood-stained tissue found on a salon floor, that has never matched any person of interest or anyone on any database anywhere in the country. That profile is still there though, still waiting. It leaves you with a $105,000 reward, still unclaimed. It leaves you with a book journalist Leonie Wallace wrote in 2012, Horrible Man, which the State Library of Victoria selected for its collection and which is credited, at least in part, with prompting the cold case review that led to Robert Penny's charging. It leaves you with a granddaughter who was 5 years old and stayed home to play on a swing, now grown, now in Los Angeles, still carrying the memory of a morning argument she was too young at the time to understand. And it leaves you with a question Claire's friends have asked since May 1991. The question that has never gone away and sits, in this case, the way a splinter sits under skin. Who was he, the man with the long hair and the creepy eyes, who came into the salon on April the 17th without triggering the doorbell? The man who stood behind Claire Acocks and said, "I don't like hairdressers. I'll be back." Was he true to his word on May the 3rd? Or was he never connected to any of this, simply a frightening stranger passing through? The kind of person a small port town produces from time to time. The kind of person who leaves no trace and means nothing in the end. Nobody knows. Claire Acocks never finished that jumper. Her grandson was born that year. Struth. Thanks again for listening to another episode of Struth. It's great to have you with us. If you'd like to hear more episodes, make sure you subscribe to Struth Premium. There's links to the Patreon below in the description of this episode. Over there you'll have access to a new episode every week. And we cover lots of different things like Struth Abroad, which are cases just like the ones we cover here every Wednesday except from all around the globe. There's Listener Tales, and I'll also be conducting some interviews with various people in the near future. Plenty of different content to keep you puzzled and terrified in between Struth episodes. On top of that, you also receive our weekly Struth episodes 1 week early and completely ad-free. But if you can't join us on Struth Premium right now, we'd still really appreciate it if you just tell a friend. Click follow or subscribe, however it works on your podcast platform. And please leave a comment in the description as well. Tell us what you think about this very puzzling case. Was it Robert Penny? Was it the Horrible Man? Or was it someone completely different? Thanks again. I'll catch you next week.